Asia has achieved remarkable economic and development progress over the past few decades. But the region today faces newer and more complex development challenges. Widening inequality, the search for new sources of growth, and climate change are among the many destabilizers to strong, inclusive, and environmentally sustainable growth. Governments across Asia are increasingly recognizing the value of sharing knowledge to tackle their persistent and emerging development problems. And this knowledge exchange will be essential for all countries in the Global South to achieve their sustainable development goals. Experience shows that development practitioners in Asia want to learn from the practical experiences of each other. They want to learn from others in the region who have gone through or are going through similar challenges. They want to be connected to each other and have ready access to practical knowledge and solutions. Knowledge exchange or peer-to-peer learning is a powerful way to share, replicate, and scale up what works in development. When done right, knowledge exchange can build the capacity, confidence, and conviction of individuals and groups to act. And that is why there is need to apply collective know-how to solve complex development challenges, which in turn is key to achieving inclusive and sustainable development results.
Let us try to build on this the introductory remarks by Mr. So, and in which he spoke about these three elements of for success, right? Of a good direction, a good blend of different abilities and capacities, and good communication among partners, and that's precisely the purpose of this session, that we elaborate on those key ingredients that are needed to promote effective South-South knowledge sharing, which is what has everyone here in this session together. And we have a great set of panelists to address the issues. So save your questions, formulate your questions either on Pigeonhole or save them for a moment in which we will come back to you to get answers to those questions that you will have to the panelists. So we have, as I said, a great set of panelists here, and we're going to start the conversation with Professor Lee to give us an overall picture of the issue that we're trying to address here, of more from the academic and policymaker point of view that she brings. So, Professor Lee, you come from a wide variety of angles. You've been in government, the Ministry of Finance and Strategy. You've been in the academic world. You've been advising ADB, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, very interesting. And so from this different perspective, can you talk about the role of knowledge and knowledge sharing in development and experiences that you may have come across in the region?
Thank you, Marvin. It's a great honor to be here, and given my strange or unique background, I would like to bring two particular set of aspects to the audience. Could you show me the slides? Yes. So I prepared the slide to warm myself up and also warm the audience up also. And what this photo shows on the right is a photo taken from the inaugural speech of the first president of South Korea, showing Dr. Seungman Lee, and he is actually the first doctoral degree holder and also the first president of South Korea. And the photo on the right shows Miss Esther Park. In Korean, her name is Kim Jom-dong. She is the first medical doctor who saved numerous lives in South Korea overall, or back then Korea or South Korea nowadays, by reaching out those who are poor, underprivileged, and have no access to medical services. And Dr. Ri, as many politicians, he has some controversies, but one of the biggest contribution he made to this country, from my perspective, is he sets a top priority to fight for literacy and expanding primary schooling in South Korea. Indeed, in his presidency, during his presidency, he set over 12% of entire South Korean budget to build primary schools, which reduced the illiteracy rate from 70% to less than 30% within a decade. So this two photos shows some examples of key figures that contribute tremendously to the South Korea. But many of, obviously these two individuals are very different and coming from a different background, but they have one common experience. Could you show me the next slide? Yes. So what is common to them is both of them get an advanced degree from the US. And that degree of that education was possible because they were able to get, quote unquote, exposed to the modern education through US missionaries. And actually these photos of the two shows the founders of the school they attended in Korea. And with the help of the alumni of these two schools, the two figures were able to finance themselves to go to the US. That's how it worked. So what this, and that's it for the slide. And so what this figure shows is that my country's experience showed that this non-conventional knowledge sharing, namely provided by these missionary schools, were able to help educate elite South Koreans that plays a big role in the history of South Korea to develop its stages over time. And so from the anecdotal evidence I just shared with you, and also maybe all of you have your own experience, and so my next step of this discussion wants to say something about the academic evidence of this importance of knowledge sharing or human capital overall. So there have been numerous studies in academic realm that shows a very big correlation between human capital building or educational attainment and a country's growth stage. But then what have been recently found, especially since early 2000, is that if we take a micro level evidence, meaning how much indeed the education helps individuals to attain more earnings, if we take the micro evidence very carefully, then the amount of contribution that education or human capital in general contribute to a growth, that amount seems to shrink tremendously. So where is the gap? So my colleague Ben Malin at FRB and myself was curious at how come this big difference comes in. The anecdotal evidence so that it must play a big role, but the micro evidence suggests that it's not really as big as we expected. So we took that kind of a curiosity in the context of China. And so what we analyze is that we take the standard approach that economists are trained to by taking the returns to education carefully, but apply to how much it helps in macro level in Chinese experience, and how much it contributes to or how much it accounts for the Chinese growth. And what we found is that if we take a very traditional approach, meaning how much of the education help workers to get paid more within non-agricultural sector, that contribution is not big. But we all know from the academia and also practitioners' point of view, a lot of the growth, especially from the bottom to the middle income country, a lot of the growth is explained by reallocation of labor from agricultural sector to non-agricultural sector. And if you allow for that possibility, the rise in schooling attainment in China from 1978 to mid-2000 that account for 11% of the growth experience. So what we found is that from, given these two conversations I just delivered to you and the audience, is that from the anecdotal point of view, the knowledge sharing, especially from the non-traditional way, could be play a very important role by educating elites And also for the macro level, the educational attainment increase could help facilitate more efficient allocation of labor that ultimately brings to the growth in the Chinese context.
Thank you very much. Countries can exchange among them, South-South countries that we're as the subject of our conversation today, in autonomous or spontaneous way, or they can be motivated through different mechanisms. Now, what is fashionable is what is called triangular South-South cooperation, in which countries are incentivized to cooperate through bilaterals or multilateral mechanisms. So let us now bring the perspective of a Vice President of the Asia Foundation. You've been in this business for years, many years, and you have seen different ways of cooperating between countries. Can you talk about this triangular way of cooperating? And do you see this as a complementary mechanism to the North-South, traditional North-South mechanism of cooperating to address the challenges of the region?
Yes, thank you, Marvin. It's wonderful to be here representing the Asia Foundation and sharing this event with two of our good institutional friends and partners, KDI, with which we've had a long-standing relationship since 2010, and with ADB, where we also have a joint MOU and are increasingly doing joint activities together. So we're delighted to be here to contribute to discussion of these very interesting and complex topics. Yes, the short answer to the question, I would say without hesitation that triangular cooperation provides a useful complement to traditional North-South models, which is why there's such growing interest in the triangular approach. Of course, this doesn't mean that North-South cooperation is going to disappear anytime soon. Going back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when developing countries had insufficient financial resources and technical capacity to take on the many key development challenges they were facing, North-South development aid helped to fill many of the gaps and contributed to significant improvements in issues such as education, health, agriculture, infrastructure, as well as general capacity building and human resource development. I think everyone would agree with that. And indeed, North-South approaches remain relevant today, including in the region, especially for less developed countries. But as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 decades, as more countries have succeeded in achieving higher levels of development, entering upper middle income or even higher income status, especially here in Asia, it is only natural and appropriate that they should want to share their own development experience and expertise with other countries in the region. This is to be welcomed, in my view. It provides exciting opportunities for traditional aid providers to partner with these emerging provider countries and with less developed partner countries in new types of triangular arrangements that can bring new energy and new benefits for everyone. So yes, triangular cooperation should not be seen as a replacement for traditional North-South approaches, and it does have some unique challenges that I'll mention briefly.
Gordon, can you put the mic a little bit closer to you?
Sure.
Because I'm told that the colleagues cannot hear.
Okay, but, much better. But as a complement, offering more choices and more options, depending on the unique circumstances of the countries and the development challenges involved. There are many aspects of triangular cooperation that are getting a lot more attention these days and make it an appealing model for contemporary development cooperation. First, it leverages comparative advantages, that is, skills, resources, experiences, technical expertise from 3, and sometimes more, different actors in 3 different perspectives to address development challenges. It allows emerging economies to play an important role in development cooperation. It exposes partners to a large number of international conferences, publications, forums to learn about new thinking and shared development practices. And there's something in this for everyone. For new providers, TRC, as we call it, allows them to showcase and to share their achievements in ways that are considered helpful. For less developed countries, it increases their options and their exposure to different models and approaches. And finally, for traditional donors, TRC is a way for them to remain relevant and engaged as ODA declines in importance compared to other financial transfers, and to try to influence and to understand non-traditional providers. And for everyone else, for all of us, what I like about triangular cooperation in particular is that it helps to blur the hierarchical distinction between aid donor and aid recipient that characterize traditional North-South development cooperation. It provides a tangible manifestation of a basic principle in international development cooperation that I think is extremely important, and that is that everyone has something to contribute and everyone has something to learn. At the same time, there are challenges in implementation and in practice to moving forward on triangular cooperation. The objectives, the interests, the background, the motivations of the three actors may not be necessarily aligned. Secondly, this type of cooperation can create administrative burdens due to various donors and international organizations having very different rules and regulations for implementation, compliance, financial management, and so on. And so in this regard, the service providing country may have difficulty in executing the timeline of the donor country, especially on things like M&E and reporting requirements. These are just facts of the matter. So to date, TRC has sometimes tended to be a bit cumbersome, a bit slow, a bit frustrating, and has impeded the level of buy-in that we would like to see. Last year, the Asia Foundation and the Network for Development Cooperation in Thailand co-convened a workshop on TRC in Asia and discussed how to facilitate and improve, enable more effective TRC, and brought together traditional donors, pivot countries, recipient countries, and there's a number of key findings came out of that. I'll just cite them very, very briefly, and then I'll conclude.
Yeah. Or perhaps you can come back to,
Okay.
to those examples, but with precisely as the subject of
That would be fine.
yeah, right? We'll come back to that. And I'm sure that the audience will also have questions on how this triangular cooperation works. And let me now go to Director General Wu Chong of the Asian Development Bank. The Asian Development Bank is a financial institution, and mostly is resources that are transferred for promoting the development of the region. But the institution also considers itself as a knowledge institution, and you are precisely the Director General of that department that manages and is responsible for knowledge in the institution. So what relationship do you see between South-South knowledge exchange and the possibilities of promoting development, sustainable development, inclusive development in the region?
Thank you very much, Marvin. And also, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, all of you here, for bringing me back to Korea, my home country. I used to come here quite regularly until about 4 years ago when I was in this current department, but I spent the last 4 years sort of working with our board members, and I think that knowledge actually is helping me do my job now. Mr. Saw of MOSF mentioned about the World Cups. I also have to talk about it because I'm passionate about it. You know, whenever I come to Korea, I love it here because two reasons. Coming from Manila, when I come here, usually it's very cool and nice environment to walk around. and I'm not jet lagged because it's very close. But this time it's actually very strange because I felt like I arrived in Manila, the heat, and second, because of the World Cup, I'm jet lagged without going anywhere because I'm up at night watching the games. But more relevant to the knowledge, Mr. Saul talked about the Korean team playing the earlier round and the later one, and pulling out the miracle against Germany. Against Mexico, we lost because our defender, when he went for tackle, he was waving his hand like this and got his handball. And I was thinking, why the hell is doing that? So obviously, he learned from the lesson. And looking at other people, I saw the defenders with their arms in the back when they're tackling. So knowledge sharing is actually happening everywhere and all the time. And this is something that ADB has also actively been involved in the last 50 years. Often when we talk about ADB, Asian Development Bank, people ask me, are you a development organization or a bank? We are both. And as Marvin said, actually, I should flip it around. You said, we're a bank, but then we are also knowledge. And I think my perspective is that we are actually knowledge first. We are a knowledge organization which happens to have money, where we can actually put knowledge into practice. So that's why our work is actually very, very complicated, because if you're a commercial bank, you look for bankable projects. You look for something to put your money and get your money back. And basically that's it, as long as you're not destroying the environment. But in our organization, going 50 years, we also care about, ultimate goal is to see the impact of what we are making with our money. So, within ADB, the evaluation department is playing a very important role in capturing how we're doing and making sure that we learn from our experience. And this South-South cooperation is very important because, especially in the beginning, in the 60s and 70s, we did learn quite a bit from the developed countries because everyone was basically poor. But over the next several years, we realized that the development of the developed country, the industrialization, happened a long time ago, before internet, for example. But the actual the development experience that's relevant today is something more recent. And that experience is actually in the developing country. But the difficulty is, how do we actually get that to learn? So obviously there's a demand. People are, as long as there's a demand, I think the knowledge will flow. But to ensure that knowledge is actually flowing in much, grand scale, we need to figure out a way to capture the knowledge and harness it and distribute, not just from the practitioners working on the ground, but events like this and others where we can actually capture and disseminate. So for us to know what works and what didn't work, and getting that knowledge to the developing countries now in all sectors is the key to our success for knowledge South-South cooperation.
Thank you very much. I like that transposition of the roles as an institution that knows and has money at the same time. Transfer of knowledge is fundamental to the function of the institution, as you said. I'm sorry. Let us now try to bring the hard evidence. Intuitively, we understand that knowledge is important for development. But let us bring now the hard evidence of what research says about the role of knowledge sharing in the particular context of where we are here in Korea. That has, we understand that has played a fundamental role. And let me ask now to Dr. Kim, what is the connection between knowledge sharing and economic development in the context of Korea? What does hard data says about this subject, and what can we learn of it?
Thank you, Marvin. It's a great pleasure to be here to discuss about enhancing the South-South knowledge exchange. First of all, I'd like to explain what the KDI has conducted the research for the knowledge sharing so far. For example, the KDI has used sound economics, and the microeconometrics technique, hard evidence, such as the impact evaluation, and key studies to have impact on knowledge sharing. So far, KDI has accumulated a total of 150 cases of the success of Korea's development policies. In particular, we believe it is very critical to provide the details of policy implementation, not just a policy plan, the details of a policy implementation. I understand the Korea success, 5% planning and 95% of implementation. So implementation matters, in other words, governance matters. Recently, KDI School and World Bank GDI, Global Delivery Initiatives, are collaborating with documenting the case studies to study the science of delivery. Okay? That was initiated by the President Jim Yong Kim in World Bank. So not just what to do, but how to do. That is very important for the KDI's research. Now, the connection between the knowledge sharing and economic development in context of Korea, and how can we learn from this? I think Korea's experience in knowledge sharing is very unique. Indeed, Korea benefited greatly from financing and advice from the international organizations such as multilateral development banks and the IMF. Indeed, World Bank and ADB provided both financing and know-how, the technical assistance, in establishing the key infrastructures such as a dam project and expressways. Moreover, Korea benefited greatly from the policy advice from the IMF. The critical reforms and the turning points in Korea's development were based on the policy advice, policy recommendations by the IMF, such as foreign exchange reform in 1964 that include the elimination of a multiple exchange rate system and the introduction of a new unitary fluctuating exchange rate system. That was part of the efforts to shift from the import substitution policy in Korea to the export promotions open economy. Before the reform, the Korean authority was worrying about the excessive fluctuations in the exchange rate following the introduction of a floating exchange rate system. At the time, in 1964, the IMF mission team, staff team, discussed with the Korean government officials, Minister of Finance particularly, they discussed the experience of several countries where exchange rates had tended to stabilize very quickly in a floating exchange rate system. In other words, in 1964, we have got some knowledge sharing of some success of the other countries of adaptation of the foreign exchange rate system from the IMF expert. Now, I'd like to introduce my recent experience, how the Korea's experience can be shared with the developing countries, briefly. I was invited, actually KDI was invited at a high-level meeting with President of Egypt and his economic team, organized by the IMF and the Egyptian government to share Korea's experience on how to overcome the 1997 financial crisis and to advance structural reform. Egypt has received IMF's rescue loans since 2016. So far, Egypt has a success in achieving the macroeconomic stabilization and the priorities for structural reforms going forward to strengthen the role of the dynamic private sector that can create job opportunities. I shared the Korean experience based upon the documentation of Korean success stories, particularly the lessons that require, the reforms require the opening up the economy. This is exactly the case of 1964 exchange rate reform, and the government leadership and strong implementation. Those resonated at the meeting with the President Sisi. I'm hoping now the meeting will be a stepping stone for designing a successful structural reform agenda in Egypt. As you see in this case, Korea has been playing a key role in bridging the gap between the developing countries and advanced countries and international organizations such as IMF and the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turki. 5% planning, 95% implementation, strong implementation. So we're just talking here about the 5%, the knowledge sharing, but it's an important word of caution that once you know, you have to implement well. And this is precisely the subject of the second round here of questions to the panelists. Again, save your questions. I know that you have already sent some, and I'll take a look at them. But let us talk about concrete examples. We have talked about the subject of knowledge sharing and importance for the development of our countries, but can you bring, Professor Lee, some examples, concrete examples of, according to your experience, of successful knowledge exchange experiences that have led to further development in countries in which you have worked?
Okay, thank you. So I would like to share my experience with you in the context of education knowledge sharing. And this project has been done with the collaboration of IDB, with the generous funding help from Ministry of Finance and Strategy in South Korea. So what we have been doing was the following. So from our previous discussion, we all agreed that knowledge building, knowledge sharing, or generally speaking, human capital accumulation is a big role, is a key component for the development. And that view has been shared by practitioners and researchers in Latin American countries as well. And many of them pointed out that the weak performances of students in Latin America or low quality of schools hinder Latin American countries develop further. And so when I interact with friends from Latin America, many of them are high-level officials or working for the international organizations specialized in Latin America. They've been keen on learning from Korea of their experience, or of quote unquote our experience, that how come South Koreans do so well, for example, in PISA or TIMSS. We've been always like top 5 countries all the time, along with other East Asian countries. And so they all know that South Korea was one of the poorest country with high level of illiteracy, but how come you developed so far to this level? So this project with IDB, what we've been doing is in twofold. The first tier is to review the South Korean education system in comparison with Latin American system and identify the potential policy instruments that is quote unquote feasible or applicable to another country that potentially help quote unquote help or alter the outcome of student performances or teacher training. And that is the first part. We've been doing pretty much quite a lot by now. And the examples of the candidates which can be implementable pretty easily is student assignment. You know, training well-educated teachers is very difficult to facilitate, But perhaps when you think about how to assign students to schools, that's relatively easy to implement. In South Korea, we have, there are some variation, but to be simplified version, students are allocated into regional schools depending upon where they live. And it restricts definitely the choice of school choice from the student's point of view, but it eliminates or it reduces the possibility that students sort themselves so that it manifests the inequality of the quality of student bodies. So there are pros and cons, but one of the aspects this IDB researchers want to implement or check is if you homogenize the student body across schools, whether this quote-unquote social mix may boost up a student outcome. That's some of the aspect they want to experiment in the Latin American setting. And that follows into the second tier, which is we've been in the middle of interaction with school organizers or school leaders in Argentina and Mexico to see whether they are willing to experiment this type of new type of assignment. And also we are in the discussion of Peruvian policymakers to adopt teacher training. So as I said before, South Korean teachers are one of the well-capable, educated group of adults in South Korean labor market. And the question is, how come you meaning the South Korea, was able to attract such talented individuals into a teaching profession? And so there are many kind of factors we've been speculating that it may be a reason why we were successful. So some of the discussions like payment schedule or incentive schedule or teacher assignment rules, we've been discussing some further policy experiment with that. Yes.
Very interesting. That's an area that definitely I'm sure that it resonates with many of you. It's an area in which all our countries can learn a lot. South Korea has been a real example of how to manage the education system. Is one of the pillars of the development of this country. But so there are several colleagues here that are precisely thirsty to hear concrete examples of good practices in South-South cooperation. So this is the time, the Vice President Gordon Hine, to talk about your concrete examples of the Asia Foundation in promoting triangular cooperation and any other form of exchanges of knowledge.
Thank you, Marvin. For us at the Asia Foundation, this is a story of evolution, of dramatic evolution. When I first joined the organization in the 1980s, we supported a large number of knowledge sharing and capacity building exchange programs in different development sectors. But at that time, in reflecting our base in the United States, these programs mostly involved Asia-US exchanges and learning, with American funding and expertise primarily brought to bear. That seems like ancient history now. Since then, our approach has completely changed 180 degrees, and we are now involved in facilitating many, many more Asia-to-Asia learnings than Asia-US programs. We think this evolution has been appropriate for an organization like ours that has been based in Asia since 1954, with permanent offices in 18 countries. Through this network of offices and our on-the-ground experience working with local partners in government, civil society, private sector, academic and research community, we're in a good position to broker Asia-to-Asia learning and knowledge sharing on different issues. And we do this through joint research, through study tours, through multi-country workshops, through provision of technical assistance from one Asian country to another. And this approach has proven to be not only substantively effective, but very much welcome by countries in the region who are very much interested in learning from their neighbors and view these developments in other Asian countries as much more relevant to them than Western models. So it's been a deliberate change in policy. So we've been working on Asia-to-Asia knowledge sharing for decades, literally hundreds of programs over the years. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but just to give you a flavor of some things that are might be of interest. providing opportunities for community mediation organizations in Nepal to learn from the very well-established nationwide system of community mediation in Sri Lanka that every year effectively handles tens of thousands of local disputes quite peacefully. Or groups from the Bangsamoro region in Mindanao studying the vibrant halal food industry and Islamic banking in Malaysia. Numerous exchanges and joint workshops for women's organizations in the region, working on gender-based violence or counter-trafficking, trying to see what works in different contexts. And even capacity building in foreign affairs, such as training mid-career diplomats from the Maldives at Sri Lanka's Foreign Service Academy, or a study tour that I organized myself that brought the Lao Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Indonesia to study the structure and operations of the Center for Education and Training at Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So these kinds of things are happening all the time. What I would like to do is be able to step back and do some kind of comprehensive review over several decades and try to aggregate up what has worked and what all this has amounted to, because these tend to be a bit ad hoc. Each one has its own review, its own report, but to step back and do a broader, longer-term evaluation about how this is working as a mechanism, as a modality, I think is something we want to take on.
That's precisely one of the questions that the audience is asking. So we'll come back to that. What is working? What is not? What are the challenges the audience is asking in using this modality of cooperation? Uchong, you said that the bank is an knowledge institution transferring funds, and I've been there for more than 50 years transferring knowledge and finance, and so obviously has accumulated a lot of experience. Can you share with us some of these experiences, successful experiences, good practice experiences derived from the interventions of ADB that have had a lasting result in the region?
Okay, thank you. Let me talk about two examples. One is on water and the other one on transport. Anybody from Cambodia here? Okay. First is on Cambodia. In order to have a good knowledge sharing South-South, you need a good knowledge to share in the first place. And in this particular case, ADB has been here for 50 years. I've been here about half of that, actually. In 1993, that's when I joined, when I was 15 years old. I was just kidding, yes, that part. And that was when ADB provided a loan to Cambodia, Phnom Penh city, to help them with their water situation. At that time, the Phnom Penh's water situation is their non-revenue water. If you're not a water person, basically it's the water leaked or stolen, was over 60%. So of 100%, 60% stolen. So no matter what you do, how much investment you pour into the water water supply system, you're not going to get the impact. So there's a gentleman named Ekson Chan who became the general manager of the water supply authority of Phnom Penh in 1993, coincidentally when I joined the bank, but I had nothing to do with that one. He really drove the agenda to basically fix the leaks, and then instead of putting new supply, and then also to corporatize the authority. It's very different from privatization. We're not talking about privatization, but corporatizing, keeping it public but making it run like a company, so that the revenue that's generated from water supply, water sales, is put back in managing the water itself and collecting revenue. So it was actually very brave task that this gentleman did, because there are sort of stakeholders, informal organizers who actually steal money and sell people to people at the very high cost. So they have to be sort of managed, and also the people, the users, they do need to experience that with a better organized water supply system, you're going to save a lot of money, because without this, you're going to be paying about 10 times what you need to pay from from the organized water supply system. So it was actually ADB loan, and it took about 7 years to bring down the 60% non-revenue water down to about less than 10%, which is incredible. So Exxon Chan became like a rock star in the development community of water. And in 2004, 5, 6, we started the first water operators partnership, which is basically twinning of water operators from one city to another city. And Phnom Penh was paired with other cities in our region, and that was a huge success because for the receiving operators to see and feel what they did in a place like Phnom Penh, it was really inspiring, and they really gave them the conviction that it actually can work if they actually follow the same model. And 3 years later, the Australian government gave us more resources, and initially we had 18 twins, and then 3 years later we launched this water operator partnership, and we have now 75 twins to largely south-south, but also south-north north as well. So in the water business, there's been quite a exciting sharing of knowledge, south-south and north. The other example is in transport. ADB's biggest sector is transport and energy. And transport, a long time ago when we were building roads, we basically built roads. We helped our countries to build highways and roads so that cars can travel back and forth. And I remember in the late 90s when we used to go to China, we used to go and there are all these people riding bicycles, and then we were saying, we're going to build you nice highways, so you please get off the bike and get in the car. But with what we know now, we're going to sustainable transport, where non-motorized transport is more important. We're going back to China, telling them to get out of the car and get back into the bicycle. So what do? How do we convince people that this actually works? And how do you inspire them? So we tapped this gentleman named Enrique Peñalosa of Bogota, Colombia. I'm sure you know who he is, right? And he was the mayor of Bogota a few years ago, and he had this initiative called Transmillennial. And it's basically the bus rapid system, and he also had lots of death threats because he had to deal with all the transport operators. But he really, during the period of his mayorship, one of the beauties of the BRT system is that it doesn't take 5 years to implement. So during his term, he was actually able to get it going so that people can actually see the difference. So we had to sort of get a waiver from our ADB's procurement rule, where you can only pay money to consultants or speakers from our member country, and Colombia is not. So we have to get a special technical assistance to allow that to happen. So we brought Enrique and came over. He's a dynamic speaker. So he really inspired all the developing countries, the transport authorities, to try to think about how they can implement. So I asked one question. I said, why is the thing called Transmillennial? What does that mean? And Enrique Peñalosa said, well, it's a sexy title. Bus rapid system just doesn't do it in Colombia, so you gotta do it. So now the result is that that talk was about 7-8 years ago, and now ADB's transport portfolio is shifting from having about 80% road portfolio now to much more balanced investment programs, including bus rapid system, MRT, and even non-motorized transport system.
Thank you very much. Very interesting examples. I have to warn the panelists that there are a number of questions that are being sent here to you. We won't be able to address all of them, but we have to save time so that we can address some of these questions. And now let me go back to Professor Kim. You spoke a moment ago about the role of knowledge for addressing some key policy issues at the very beginning, particularly in the exchange races. But I'm sure that there are many other areas in which knowledge has played a fundamental role in shaping policies that contributed to what has happened, the miracle that has happened in Korea. Can you talk about this, the role of knowledge in shaping policies, and how can this type of experience be transferred to other countries?
Yes, I can give you some examples of some industrialization policy and export promotion policy. Many countries saw Korea's rapid development in the 1960s and 70s, and they wanted to learn about Korea's experience. Please, chart, please. KDI policy research reports used to support Korea's own development were translated into other languages, English, even Chinese, and disseminated due to high demand. I'd like to introduce one anecdotal story. That research report, it was conducted in the late 1970s. This is the study on analyzing the factors behind Korea's growth, applying growth accounting methodology. Now, this was published in the Sources of Rapid Growth in Korea in 1979 in English, and Chinese government translated this study in Chinese, the whole book. At the time, even though Korea did not have formal diplomatic relations with China, this study became a very useful reference for Chinese policymakers, not only central government officers, but local government officers who sought to learn about the lessons from Korea's rapid transformation. Since there was a strong demand for sharing the Korean experience, there's a strong demand for sharing Korean experience. Korea is one of the first countries to engage in South-South cooperation through the KDI. The relevant picture is this. In cooperation with the Korean government, Ministry of Economic Planning Board at the time, KDI established International Development Exchange Program in 1982, we called IDEP, to promote knowledge sharing and capacity building. This is just the South-South knowledge sharing in 1982. Since 1982, IDEP engaged in knowledge sharing by training over 20,000 government officers from over 160 countries. This is the first forum. One participant in these pictures now become the Prime Minister of Brunei Republic. And our program also includes some study tour in the industrial complex, Changwon Machine Industrial Complex, so that the participants can experience the seeing is believing in Korea. KDI also cooperated with multilateral development banks like the World Bank to host high-level workshop with Korean policymakers. Just 손종희 씨, 네, 스탑 해주시죠. In 1987, the first workshops was organized with World Bank for China again, who was interested in Korea's export-led growth and the promotion of a heavy and chemical industry. This workshop led to greater cooperation and more detailed discussions on policymaking between Korean policymakers and Chinese high-level government officers. The Korean government officers at the time, the Deputy Prime Minister, Kim Man-jae, who was the former president of KDI, as well as Vice President Seo Sang-mok, attended this important meeting. In the workshop, the Chinese government officials focused on the technical and institutional questions. How had the Korea select which industries to support? How to do picking the winners? And what policy instruments were mobilized to stimulate the higher investment by the industrial groups like chaebols? What barriers had they encountered in the main export markets? How had Korea obtained the appropriate technology? What about the role of America in supporting the South Korea? And finally, what support, financial and technical, had Korea received from the international organizations such as World Bank and Asia Development Bank, ADB, and so on? The Chinese high-level government officers, I think, benefited enormously from the very frank responses they got from their Korean counterparts. This knowledge-sharing model was also used for other developing societies, such as Vietnam and Malaysia. In case of Vietnam, the country wanted to know how to balance between the market-based economy and social-based economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Again, as we said at the beginning, a lot to learn from South Korea, and that's why we are here. I have a number of questions from the participants that are coming in here through Pigeonhole, but I'm sure that you, some of you may also like to ask questions directly to the panelists. While you warm up, let me address some of the questions that I have here from the audience. If we are short, we can give space for many more participants to come in here. Professor Lee, there's a question on the role of incentives for teachers. How does that work here? Precisely the point that you were making. To Vice President Gordon Haina, so the role of culture and particularities of each country in the transfer and adaptation of knowledge sharing. For Director General Wuchon, it's a question of plans for ADB to expand South-South technical cooperation in the region. What are the perspectives? And for Professor Kim, what are the centers of South-South cooperation here in Korea? Apart from KDI, and this is also a question for you. We have a representative from many countries here. What do they have to focus on? What type of institutions, and how does that work in transferring knowledge from Korea to other countries? So, if we are brief on this question, again, please reserve your questions and make them directly to the panelists. Yes, please, Professor Lee.
Okay, so the question is regarding the incentive schemes for the teachers. So how it works in South Korea is the initial pay, what I try to say is that on average, the compensation for the teachers in terms of the baseline pay is quite high. And particularly the employment status is very stable and very much accommodating for women in terms of fertility leave and so forth. So from the very beginning, it attracts a lot of talented individuals, particularly from the women's side. And conditional on being employed as a teacher, some may, especially someone who's trained in the U.S. system, may concern that maybe there is not enough bonus incentive pay to those teachers. But once you select the talented individuals from the beginning, the follow-up incentive scheme is not necessarily you have to have a very strict one. So in the context of South Korea, there is an evaluation schemes, but then it doesn't necessarily involve in monetary compensation per se as an individual. But there is a school-wide accountability practice that has been introduced in 2010. So what has been done from that particular scheme is sort of like get some idea or inspiration that is similar to the U.S. Education reform, that is No Child Left Behind. So different from the U.S. system, what it does is the Korean government, namely Ministry of Education, identifies some low-performing schools instead of low-performing teachers. But once they identify these low-performing schools, what they did is they provided extra teachers and teaching consultancy for the teachers so that they were able to help the students with the help of an extra curriculum after school programs so that they were able to push these low performing schools into the certain level the Korean government wants to set. So depending upon the cultural background, quote unquote, the less developed countries are in, the Korean system may work or may not, but the U.S. researchers who studied the U.S. incentive schemes for the teachers, the evidence is pretty mixed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it even damages the morale of teachers, or sometimes it brings some quote-unquote corruption in testing. So the Korean system suggested that maybe the starting scheme to attract motivated teachers by providing quality benefits to them. Well, sometimes it's a monetary benefit, sometimes it's non-monetary benefit like a flexible schedule. That could be one way to think about further.
Excellent. That's a perfect segue precisely to the question that has been posed to you, Vice President. I'm right at, so you have the knowledge, but not necessarily can be applied to different contexts. What's the role of culture, concept, politics, right, in transferring knowledge?
Yeah, I was going to expand the idea of culture to include politics because they both can facilitate and they can both hinder. Certainly these issues are extraordinarily important if you're trying to promote knowledge sharing and get mutual buy-in between representatives of different countries. If countries are starting with fairly common assumptions, it's of course much easier. That's why we've had good luck doing joint knowledge sharing around ASEAN-related issues, just because there's so much history of the 10 countries doing things together and in similar manners. So they're used to the rituals of cooperation and sharing of information. But issues like expanding opportunities for women, obviously that's going to be an easier assignment in some Asian countries than others. And so one needs to be open-minded, realistic. One needs to work with local champions of change. So it's not the outside actor that is seen as trying to dictate to individuals in a certain country that they should somehow change their culture. So it requires some subtlety, some nuance, some buy-in and leadership from people in country, because it's just not appropriate for outsiders to be taking that on. The only other thing I'd mention is on the political side, the Asia Foundation does have a number of projects over the years with North Korea. And there too, if you're talking about knowledge sharing, there are huge walls of suspicion and just basic information and knowledge that have to be overcome in order to reach a point of receptivity where you can actually get through to people and have them learn some new some new skills. So we've been providing training for North Korean officials in China, Peking University, Hong Kong, around international business law, and also in Mongolia around forestry this past year. And just 2 weeks ago, the mayor of Ulaanbaatar convened the 3rd Northeast Asia Regional Mayors Conference, bringing together mayors from South Korea, from Japan, from China, from Russia, but also North Korea. So I think sometimes framing these things in a regional manner where people feel a sense of common fate, if you will, or some element of like-mindedness is a way to reduce the cultural differences to the point where people can be open-minded.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Director General Wuchon, the question is not only about the plans, but also the question is about the knowledge gaps that you see that are critical to overcome in the region, and therefore projections of the bank in this field.
Yeah, so on this expansion of our knowledge sharing south-south or even north-south, we're trying to do 3 things. One is, first is money, second is about our organization, and third is about innovation. So in terms of money, when you try new idea, new technology to be adopted into our developing countries, this is where, as I said earlier, where rubber meets the road, where we got to apply things in a country-specific situation. So it's going to cost money and also higher risk. So a number of our developed member countries are giving us some resources for us to be able to deploy new technology. Deploy, what we mean is that we give concessional financing to try new idea, whether it's renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. So we have one in particular, we have a high-level technology fund which is created with the Japanese money, where we identify a new technology to be applied to a particular country context. Second, on the organization, one of the deficiencies of the current situation is that we have tremendous amount of knowledge captured in the in publication, and those are the explicit knowledge. But from our perspective, our real value from ADB is our explicit tacit knowledge. So when our hydro experts who are working on the ground, and at the end there will be dams built, but during the process they have to hurdle many difficulties, and many of those knowledge is captured in the head. So we actually, Gambir Bata, he's sitting over there, wave your hand. He's the head of our knowledge sharing and services unit, and one of the many things he's doing, and one of the thing is, how do we actually capture the tacit knowledge of our mission leaders and experts on the ground so that that can be shared? It would be nice to send our experts everywhere, but we can't do that always. And lastly, about innovation, we're looking at on the organization, so KSSC, and also we recently created sort of his twin sister unit in our Department of Communication called Knowledge Management. So they're in charge of disseminating. So Gambir would pick up, capture, and then our knowledge, the disseminators will disseminate in a wide range of modalities. And in that context, innovation, how do we actually disseminate, these, we'll be doing traditional events like this, but we'll try to probably use social media but a lot more. And I started to get involved in social media about 4 years ago when my son went to college, because I wanted to monitor him, in a very subtle way, without participating. So I joined the Facebook, and I was lucky that he friended me, so I'm kind of watching. But the rule number 1, if you have kids, do not like your kids, whatever, because the moment you like, you'll be cut off. So I started to learn from there, and then I started to, he was being careful, so I decided to go into Instagram. So again, quietly kind of monitoring. But then I realized that actually in the midst of trying to monitor my kid, there's tremendous amount of knowledge, development knowledge being shared through the modalities instantaneously. So once I gave a talk in New York, and then in Colombia, and then I went to DC 5 hours later And then in between 5 hours, my presentation was shared by participants all over the place, and without me even knowing. And so that's one example of how we can look forward to capture and disseminate knowledge through some media that we are not familiar with. So we need to work with more young people.
Thank you. Thank you. Younger than us, right? We are young, still young, Yusuf, right? But a bit younger than us, right? Professor Kim, who are the players and perhaps the role of KDI as well in South-South knowledge of transfer?
Again, I think it is important to share not only lessons, but also the details using the case studies documented by KDI and KDI School. Again, how to do, implement, develop the policies. This is the crucial for knowledge sharing. International Development Exchange Program, IDEP, established in 1982. I think it was a very successful, indeed, pioneer leaders of South-South knowledge sharing, because it led to greater cooperation and discussions on details. Again, the details of policy making, not just a policy recommendation. I can give just one example of how some details of the policy implementation of the Korea had in the past related to the ADB assistance. In the late 1960s, ADB assisted Korea to construct the first expressway in Korea, Seoul-Incheon Expressway. ADB not only provided financing, $3.5 million US, but also provided recommendation, but also recommended the Korean government to establish the Korean Expressway Corporation, state-owned enterprise, to manage large expressway infrastructure projects. At the time, in the late 1960s, in Korea, about 80% of the Korean road were not paved, unpaved, but Korea commit to construct the expressway. So ADB has some worry whether South Korea can manage that expressway project. So ADB, on the one hand, providing the $3.5 million long-term project at concessional loans, and at the same time, South Korea should enhance the managerial skill so that recommended to establish the state-owned enterprise, and then we followed, we adopted a recommendation so that that state-owned enterprise did a success job. So this kind of some detailed story of the policy implementation, KDI has been documented for the past 35 years, and the discussion with developing society experts, with the support from the Ministry of Strategy and Finance. So I think the KDI and KDI School in Korea would be the center of the knowledge sharing and the capacity building, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we have until 11:15, right? So, okay, so anyone would like to intervene, ask a question to the panelists? This is the moment. Yes, please. Identify yourself, number one, please, and indicate to whom you are asking the question, which panelist.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Priyanto from Indonesia, working for National Development Planning, Bappenas. So my question is for a colleague from ADB. I would like to know whether ADB has a future a plan program to more engage in the South-South cooperation. So as we know, with the World Bank, we have the South-South facility, but for IDB, we don't hear that you can have specific issue to be engaged in the South-South cooperation. So in this case, I would like to also inform to you that our government is open to have triangle cooperation with the ADB. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I am Chelladurai Solomon from India, Community of Evaluators, South Asia. I mean, it's inspiring to understand the different knowledge, the depth of knowledge we have. And also it's also good to know the knowledge sharing is very much, the government is a major actor. But as we also see that we need to have the local leaders or the local champions. But how do you really kind of bring them into act? I feel there is a gap. Because if you take from the point of India, this is whole, the waste management is a huge issue in all the cities. But whereas if you take Korea, just going around here, you don't find any kind of dirt or plastic paper. But if you go to any cities in India, you'll find there is a huge issue. This has been an issue for long, long years. But this knowledge is there very much. But it has not really kind of, it is shared. Our politician planners and the government people have visited, and it's also shared, but nothing has happened. But somewhere some problem is there. So the local champions are there, how it is recognized, how this Asia Development Bank or Asia Foundation, how do they really recognize them? How do you really bring them into act? I think that somewhat I feel there is some gap. I'd like the panelists to make some comments on that.
Perfect. Thank you. That's coming back to the point of 5% planning, 95% execution that Dr. Kim was talking about. But so any panelists can address that one. Any more questions, comments? Why don't we start here? Yes, right.
Question to Gordon. During the answer to the first round question, you discussed about some potential or practical challenge to TRC related to the multinational development banks or even perhaps Asian Foundation. But I guess some of this slowdown through the procedure could be related to the accountability. And so do you have any particular examples that may not harm accountability, but maybe fasten up the speed of the process?
Very good. Question from within as well. And we have a question over there at the very end.
From Georgia. I have a question to the organizers in general. Thank you for inviting us here. Since yesterday it has been very, very interesting. Today is even more interesting. But my question is regarded to the future of the South-South cooperation and learning exchange, because I think it's just the beginning, and I think everybody's interested to know what are the plans for the future of the event, because there are many, many things to be discussed, a lot of knowledge to be shared, and it would be wonderful to hear if we will go into details. If, for example, not only Korean experience, but also different case studies will be also presented in the future. So what are the plans of the discussion?
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll hear from ADB, I would say. I mean, also the Asia Foundation can speak here, and there'll be someone from KDI can speak to that effect, and I would ask our Deputy General, Director General of IED to talk a little bit about the knowledge sharing within the context of evaluation. So let me start then with Wuchong.
Yes. So a question from Indonesia and in India, they're somewhat related, so I'll take both. So, what we're doing in the future in scaling up, I think I partly answered that question in my previous round by providing money to actually deploy technology into our operations in our region, and also working with our knowledge sharing services center, where they will come up with best way to capture tacit knowledge which can be shared, and tapping our social media to innovatively push our knowledge out. In comparison with the World Bank, we do probably more than them, but we are a bit shy, so we don't actually talk about it too much. So we should probably talk about what we do more. And I think the question behind your question is whether we are interested in working with the Indonesian government to set up some sort of collaboration to do the South-South knowledge sharing. We'll be happy to consider that. And in fact, my boss, our vice president, is from Indonesia, so I'm sure he'll be very happy to do. On the colleague from India, the sanitation issue, there are many ways of actually provoking people. And I remember there was a sanitation workshop a few years ago, again about 5-6 years ago, where we did a knowledge product on sanitation and the financing of the financial implication of lack of sanitation. And in that report, I think we quoted something like $250 million a year loss in tourism revenue in India because of the poor sanitation. So that really worked up the senior government officials of India, including the finance ministry, because when you talk about money, revenue getting lost because of something, they do get involved. So one of the things that we can try to do is work with the finance ministries, because at the end, things cost money to fix. So we need the technical ministries as well as the planning ministry and the finance ministry to work together so that we can deliver a program that will better the lives of the countries. But one particular thing we did about 3 years ago was our executive board of directors in ADB, these are resident board members who are representing our countries, and we have 12 of them, and we took all of them to Japan and Korea to show them what are some of the recent green growth initiatives that are happening. So first in Japan, and then we came here, and then we looked at sanitation plants, the power plants, clean coal, renewable energy, you name it. And in particular, when we took them to the Songdo area with a huge landfill, it was a beautiful park, right? But it's a garbage dump basically. But you would never realize that. So and then that one, and then also this in Japan, when we went to the supercritical coal-fired power plant, where they had a very, very efficient technology, and it was like spotlessly clean. So the Indian board member in particular were really interested in working with ADB to develop some programs to implement some of these. So, provocation by putting technically accurate reports on how the economy is suffering because of something like sanitation, and making people aware at the right levels and the right ministries so that something can be done about it.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
On the sanitation issue, a couple of thoughts and examples. We had some success in the city of Ulaanbaatar and also in the city of Phnom Penh around what was essentially a political economy analysis and intervention to try to understand what the constraints were for solid waste disposal under the current arrangement of ownership and political loyalties. And in Phnom Penh, there was a long-running monopoly that was given up by the city. And the incentive for them to do a thorough job of cleaning up small neighborhoods was not a strong incentive, because they would never have to rebid the award. And so this got in the newspaper, and there was a lot of discussion about the city of Phnom Penh wanting to benefit by bringing in competing firms to do the trash pickup in different parts of the city. So this is, you know, a politically potentially risky approach, looking at a policy reform, but it's one way to unpack a situation, identify, you know, the current situation is not working. Why isn't it working? And whose interest is the status quo? And then how might you build a coalition of actors who have a different view about how the sanitation system could function, and generate enough political clout among that group to actually change the policy. In Ulaanbaatar, there was a very progressive governor who, for the first time, wanted to provide public services into the unplanned GARE areas that surround the city, the yurt areas that have no public services. He was a politician who wanted to get reelected. He saw lots of votes, citizens in these GARE areas. So he was the first one to put in public services. We helped him out. We had a series of drones that would fly over the city of Ulaanbaatar, take high-resolution photos of community areas that hadn't been mapped. And then through a participatory exercise, the mayor convened neighborhood groups to look at the maps and collectively decide, where should we put the solid waste facilities? Where should we put the kindergartens? Where should we put the bus lines? None of which had ever been put in before.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Where to from here? That question that has been raised there. Here is where I want to ask our Director General, Deputy Director General, to intervene too. But let me start with Professor Kim, Professor Lee. Where to from here is a question that was asked. All very interesting what we have heard, but where do we take this?
I'd like to respond from the gentleman from Georgia. Yep. The case studies not only South Korea but also other developing society. So I'd like to briefly introduce what the KDI, particularly KDI school, is doing now. KDI, we have a graduate school, KDI School for Public Policy and Management. Every year, we recruited 160 foreign students from over 80 countries, master degree program and PhD program, master of development policy and master of the public policy and public management. Now, under the leadership of Professor Taejong Kim, we are now trying to train the foreign students to have a writing capacity of case studies. Actually, we are combine the two MOOC program. One is the government program, government reform program by the Princeton University, led by the Professor Widener. And another MOOC program is prepared by the World Bank, again, the GDI, Global Delivery Initiatives. So they just focus on how to write the case studies. So combining these two MOOC programs, the Professor Kim is now trying the teaching, the training, the capacity building in case studies. We started 1 year ago. This is the second the program. So I think with that efforts, we ultimately can get the kind of a knowledge center as to focusing on, again, implementation matters and the government matters. Actually, we are doing that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, Professor Lee. What challenges need to be addressed going forward? Where do we go from here?
Obviously, many of the big topics brought by the panelists and then also the audience. So the one particular angle I would like to share with you with the opinion is regarding rigorous policy evaluation efforts. I mean, it's been promoted by many of the international development organizations, and particularly in your division. But when it comes to, say, South collaboration, one of the angle we back of our mind must have in is how to justify all this efforts in terms of money or in terms of human resources to quote unquote support less developing countries from, say, the other part of the southern countries' point of view, like the taxpayers' point of view. We made enough efforts, why do we have to increase our burden to share more of the resources? So what I tried to say is, from my understanding of this South collaboration, is not only helpful to less developing countries per se, but also it can be very helpful to quote unquote the donor's perspective. So for the case of this policy evaluation, so now many of you may follow South Korean policy debates or economic conditions, and many of this very controversial discussion or debates boiled down to the fact that there have been very little statistics-based policy evaluation is missing. Because that the missing information, a lot of discussion boils to like belief or their conjecture, so forth. So one of the key feature in all this ODA or South collaboration usually bring into a big component of evaluation program at the beginning, ex ante and ex post. So if we are familiar with this practice and maybe re-export these practices to the donor countries so that it can boost up the quality of policy making, it could be also very beneficial.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Obviously, in the area of evaluation, we very much agree. And precisely on this, if Veronique Salsa-Lusac is the Deputy Director General of Independent Evaluation of ADB, if you can briefly talk about our plans to disseminate, and then to Professor, I will turn the floor to you in a moment. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Marvin. Thank you for this question. I think it's really key to understand that when we talk about knowledge sharing, what is important is the right information to the right audience at the right time. And the right information is really captured from tacit knowledge, as Wu Sheng was saying earlier, formal knowledge, as Professor Kim was mentioning, but also evaluation knowledge. In our case at independent evaluation at ADB, we are really putting a lot of emphasis on the learning aspect. Of course, our first primary role is accountability, but it's also very important that we capture the lessons learned from evaluations to share these lessons and make sure that these lessons are accessible. So that's where we use a whole range of tools. The website, of course, social media, events like today. We have also smaller events where we disseminate information on specific evaluations. So that's more closer to the case study that our representative from Georgia was talking about. It could be, for example, on the evaluation that we had on water and sanitation in Nepal. It can be on maybe gender and how EDB approach gender. So we have these type of events also. I think that actually to make information accessible is really important, but valued is also very important. What you did yesterday, most of you were part of this training session, understanding better what evaluation is and the criteria that are being used. I think that type of knowledge sharing is also very important to also equip you to better understand knowledge from evaluation, from the other evaluation that you're using. And utilization, I think that's where we all need to bring together our power and forces, because I think that's actually what is weak. It's not just capturing this knowledge, it's making sure that it's being utilized. In our case at ADB, it's actually making sure that lessons from evaluation are being used in the project cycle to inform the new project. And that's where we are also working very closely with Wu Sheng's department and Gambia to make sure that evaluation knowledge is valued and understood by ADB operators, but also by representatives from governments and agencies to make sure that these lessons are used in the project in the future. So we're working on that. We're working on using also, there are some innovative ways of doing it using innovative Watson program, which is cognitive intelligence or artificial intelligence, where in a few years we will be able to ask a question that what did we learn on the energy sector in Pakistan, and we will have some answers coming from a large variety of projects and products and reports. So we are also working on that, having events like today, and maybe also in the future having some videos and other type of media used to make sure that the information is shared.
Thank you very much, Veronique. You can continue talking after the session. One last intervention to Professor.
It's not an intervention. I wanted to share some thoughts prompted by the intervention by the Indian gentleman. And I think Veronique partly addressed some of his concerns when you talked about utilization, how it is the key. And I think Professor Kim also talked about how implementation is important, 95%. I also recalled the message, the key message that Mr. Saw delivered in his morning address. He talked about the importance of three things: self-direction, adaptation, and communication. For knowledge transfer to really work in the sports of international soccer. In the area of waste management, I think about an example. So in South Korea, we implemented what we call the waste disposal fee system. So you need to buy plastic bags to dispose domestic garbage. And one may think it's a simple economics inspired idea. Because you have to pay to dispose, people will strive to reduce garbage production, and recycling efforts will be enhanced. But from case studies that we have conducted at KDI school, we have learned a lot of efforts had to be made involving the civil society organizations, the media, the local governments, to change the prevailing norms of the citizens, right? We had been accustomed to the idea of just throwing away the garbage, and it was a hard struggle, for most people to adapt to the new idea of having to pay, right? So I think knowledge transfer, sharing is a very important part of the process in development cooperation, but that's only the beginning of a long process that can be arduous.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can conclude with that thought. Again, the proportion of 5% and 95%. So this is only the beginning. Enhancing our knowledge, sharing it, but good implementation, understanding the political circumstances and the particularities of our countries is fundamental. Well, let me close with this here, and would you please join me in expressing our appreciation to the panel for their intervention.